The cold wind whistled through the empty streets as a young boy, no older than 10, sat on the cracked sidewalk, hugging his thin jacket around his small frame. His shoes were worn out, barely held together with tape, and his hands trembled from the chill. He wasn't begging, nor was he asking for help. He just sat there, staring at the bright lights of the nearby cafe, where people laughed and enjoyed their warm meals. Then, footsteps, heavy boots against the pavement. A tall police officer approached, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the streetlight. He stopped in front of the boy, arms crossed, eyes filled with disdain. "Hey, kid, you can't just sit here like that," the officer said, his voice sharp and impatient. "Move along." The boy looked up, his big, innocent eyes reflecting sadness, but no anger. "I'm not bothering anyone, sir," he said softly. The officer scoffed. "Oh, so now you're talking back. What, you think someone like you deserves to sit in a nice place like this?" He laughed, shaking his head. "People like you are just looking for handouts. Go do something useful." The boy lowered his gaze, biting his lip to keep the tears from spilling. He wasn't here for pity. He wasn't here for charity. He was waiting for someone who might never come back. The officer smirked. "That's what I thought. Now get lost before I have to make you." Just then, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The door opened and a young boy stepped out, his blonde hair neatly combed, his clothes perfectly tailored. He had the kind of presence that made people stop and take notice. It was Barron Trump. He looked at the officer, then at the shivering boy on the ground, and in that moment, the air seemed to shift. With a calm but firm voice, Barron spoke. "Why are you treating him like that?" The officer straightened up, caught off guard. I was just..." But Barron didn't let him finish. He walked over to the boy and did something that no one expected. And that was the moment everything changed. To be continued. Barron knelt beside the boy, his eyes filled with something the officer had lacked: compassion. Without hesitation, he took off his expensive jacket and gently draped it over the boy's shoulders. The officer watched in stunned silence, shifting, uncomfortably. He hadn't expected this. The boy hesitated before gripping the soft fabric, his small fingers tracing the seams, as if afraid it would be taken away. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Barron smiled. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the boy replied, still shivering. Barron nodded. "Daniel, why are you out here alone?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at the officer, who still loomed over them, arms crossed. It was clear he didn't like how the situation was unfolding. Barron noticed. He stood up and faced the officer directly. "Why were you being so rude to him?" His voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority in it that even the officer couldn't ignore. The officer scoffed, trying to regain control of the moment. "Look, kid, you don't understand how this works. I see kids like him all the time. Most of them are trouble. If you start giving them things, they'll just take advantage of you." Barron frowned. Take advantage? He wasn't even asking for anything. The officer had no real response. He shifted uncomfortably and looked away. Barron turned back to Daniel. "Where's your family?" Daniel's face fell, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then finally, he spoke. "My mom. She's sick. She lost her job a few months ago, and we got evicted. She's staying at a shelter, but there wasn't enough space for me. She told me to wait outside while she tries to figure something out." Barron's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A kid like Daniel left to suffer on the streets, While people like this officer just looked down on him without a second thought, Barron turned to his security detail, who had been standing silently by the SUV. "Get my dad on the phone," he ordered. The officer's eyes widened. "Wait, your dad?" His face paled as realization set in. He had just been caught mistreating a homeless kid in front of the son of one of the most powerful men in the country. One of the guards handed Barron a phone, and within moments, a familiar voice came through the speaker. "Hey, Barron, what's going on?" Barron took a deep breath. "Dad, there's something you need to know." As Barron began explaining everything, the officer shifted nervously, sweat forming on his forehead. He had made a mistake, a big one. Daniel watched the conversation unfold, still clutching the warm jacket around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for. Hope. And little did they know, this was only the beginning of something much bigger. To be continued. There was a long pause on the phone before the voice on the other end spoke again. "Where are you?" Barron looked at his surroundings. "Just outside a cafe near downtown. There's a boy here. His name is Daniel. He needs help." The voice on the phone grew serious. "Stay there." The officer, who had been silent this entire time, suddenly straightened up. He had no doubt who Barron was speaking to. And now panic crept into his expression. He cleared his throat and took a small step back. "Listen, kid. Maybe I was too harsh. I didn't mean anything by it." Barron gave him a look that said he wasn't buying it. He turned his attention back to Daniel. "Come on, let's get you something warm to eat." For the first time that night, Daniel hesitated not out of fear, but disbelief. No one had ever stood up for him like this before. Barron led him inside the cafe, where the warmth immediately surrounded them. A few people looked up, recognizing him, but he ignored the attention. He helped Daniel into a seat and ordered food, making sure he had whatever he wanted. As Daniel took small, careful bites, still unused to kindness, the sound of approaching sirens filled the night air. The officer outside shifted nervously as a black SUV rolled up, and within moments, the cafe door opened. A tall man stepped inside. His presence alone was enough to make the entire room go quiet. Daniel froze mid-bite, his eyes wide. Even the officer, who had been so confident before, stood stiffly, unsure of what to do. Barron stood up and walked over. "Dad," Donald Trump nodded at his son before his eyes shifted to the small, fragile boy at the table. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked. Then he turned to the officer. "You're the one who harassed this kid?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. The officer stammered. "Sir, I didn't know who." "That doesn't matter," Trump interrupted, his gaze sharp. "The question is, would you have treated him any differently if you had?" The officer's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. Trump sighed and looked at Daniel again. "Where's your mother?" Daniel swallowed. "At the shelter, but they didn't have room for me." A moment passed, then Trump turned to one of his security staff. "Find his mother. Get them a place to stay." Daniel's eyes welled up. "Really?" Trump nodded. "No kid should have to go through this." Tears spilled down Daniel's face as he tried to say, "Thank you," but the words wouldn't come out as security made arrangements. Trump turned back to Barron. "You did good." Barron smiled slightly. "He deserved better." Trump nodded, then turned to the officer. "As for you," he didn't finish the sentence, but the officer paled. He knew that whatever came next wouldn't be good for him. That night, Daniel and his mother were reunited, no longer left to struggle alone. And as Barron watched them hug tightly, he realized something. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness could change someone's life forever. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't just about Daniel. It was about making sure no one else had. To feel invisible again. The night had started with cruelty, but it ended with hope. And that was something no one would ever forget. The end.